It started with a mistake, a wrong name, whispered into the dark, not meant for the man beside me. He didn't notice, or pretended not to, and I stared at the ceiling, my chest burning with the shame of a love I never dared to live. The name, I said, wasn't Greg's, it was yours. The man who only ever borrowed my glances, never my hand. He used to come into the shop on Thursdays, always smelling like rain and old paperbacks, asking if I had anything by Neruda, always skipping the poems about happy endings. And I never told you that I kept every receipt, every folded corner, of a book you touched. I loved you in the spaces between commitments, in the silence between good intentions and real choices. Have you ever loved someone in secret, so deeply it cracked the heart you promised to someone else? Eleanor Hartley lived a quiet life, the kind that didn't make headlines or stir gossip at the local diner, but settled instead like dust on an old bookshelf, unnoticed, yet always present. At 47, she managed a small bookstore in Bridgeley, Vermont, where mornings smelled of ground cinnamon and the pages of secondhand novels. People came in for stories. Few realized she was holding one inside her, unwritten, unread, and deeply unfinished. She shared her home with Greg, a kind man who folded his socks precisely and left notes on the fridge that read, "Milk" or "Don't." "Forget your scarf." Their love, if it could still be called that, had mellowed into routine. They spoke kindly, laughed politely, slept on opposite edges of the bed. There was no storm, no cruelty, just the quiet erosion of intimacy, day by day. Eleanor had once dreamed of writing poetry, had once believed in being chosen wildly and without hesitation. Now, she kept her desires tucked away between receipts and unsent letters. Her daughter, Emma, visited on holidays and spoke in rushed sentences, always halfway out the door. The house, filled with photographs and folded blankets, often felt like a museum of someone else's life. Then there was Jonas Rayner, the man who stepped into her bookstore every December with a crooked smile and questions about sad books. He never stayed long, but when he left, the room always felt emptier. He was polite, distant, but Eleanor remembered the way he ran his finger along the spine of the collected Sappho, and the way he once said, "Some words ache longer than others." She never told Greg about Jonas, never told Jonas about herself. Instead, she lived in that quiet, secret ache, the space between two names she never dared say out loud in the same room. Sometimes she would sit behind the counter, listening to the jazz radio crackle softly and wonder, what if the love of your life was someone you never truly touched? It was the first snowfall of the year, soft as powdered sugar and barely clinging to the cobbled sidewalk outside the quiet shelf. Eleanor had just turned the closed sign and was halfway through her evening ritual, watering the fern by the window, reshelving a stack of forgotten cookbooks, when the chime above the door rang out. She froze. No one ever came this late, not without calling ahead. He stood there in the doorway, shaking snow from his coat, looking just the same and somehow completely different. Jonas Rayner. December had brought him back again, like a story she couldn't rewrite. "I wasn't sure you'd still be here," he said, voice warm but cautious, like someone returning to a place that had once hurt. Eleanor's heart skipped, not with excitement, but with recognition of all the things unsaid that still hung in the air between them. "I'm always here," she said, a little too quickly. The books wouldn't organize themselves. He smiled, that half smile that always seemed to carry a secret. "Then it's good I didn't bring chaos." They didn't hug, didn't shake hands, just stood a breath apart, like old habits they never got around to breaking. Jonas handed her a copy of a worn paperback, Letters to a Young Poet. "I found this in my mother's attic. I think it belonged to you." Eleanor took the book slowly. The cover was frayed at the edges, a faint coffee stain across the corner. Her name, scrawled in her own handwriting, was still on the inside flap. She hadn't seen it in years. "I must have lent it to you," she said, though she didn't remember doing so. "You didn't," he replied gently. "You left it on a bench. After that reading downtown, remember? I picked it up. I meant to. Return it." She nodded, unsure what to do with her hands, her thoughts, the rising warmth in her chest. The book felt heavier now, like it carried every sentence she had been too careful to say. They stood in silence, the kind only two people with shared pauses could share. Then Jonas looked around and said, "This place hasn't changed much. It's me who has," she meant to say, but didn't. She made tea, though he hadn't asked. Chamomile for him, always. She remembered without needing to remember. The kettle whistled like a memory she couldn't quiet, and when she handed him the mug, their fingers brushed. Just lightly, but her whole body tensed, as if that tiny touch had collapsed 1,000 careful walls. Jonas took a sip, nodded in quiet appreciation. "Still too hot," he murmured, lips curling in that boyish way she had only seen in wintertime. "You always served it too early." "And you always drank it anyway," she replied, smiling despite herself. He looked around the shop again, eyes scanning the shelves like they might hold the answers to questions he couldn't ask. "I saw your name in the town newsletter. Said you were opening up Saturday readings again." She nodded, tightening her cardigan. Small things, to keep the quiet from feeling too loud. He didn't ask about Greg. She didn't offer. The name stayed between her teeth like a secret. She no longer knew how to carry. As Jonas stood to leave, he placed something else on the counter. A thin bookmark, folded once. "That fell out of the book," he said. "I thought it was trash, but it has handwriting." She unfolded it. The words were hers, unmistakably so. Written in blue ink, slanted slightly right. Her signature. Curl on the Y. It was a fragment of a letter. One she had written but never meant for anyone to read. Certainly not him. "Did you read it?" she asked, almost breathless. "No," he said, and she believed him. But the way he looked at her, quiet, open, and unbearably gentle, told her that maybe he didn't need to. He adjusted his scarf, already moving toward the door. "You know," he said, pausing, "some things don't need a name to be real." Then he left. The door closed softly behind him, but the room didn't return to silence. Instead, it thrummed, like a page halfway turned, like music fading but not gone. Eleanor stood still, bookmark in hand, heart unmoored. That night, she reread her letter. Every word she'd tried to forget. And for the first time in years, she wondered not just what if, but what now. The next morning, the shop felt different, like something had shifted imperceptibly, the way a chair is moved just an inch, but enough to trip you in the dark. Eleanor opened early, though there was no reason to. She told herself it was habit, but her fingers kept grazing the letter fragment Jonas returned, tucked neatly between the register and the stack of receipts she hadn't filed in months. She didn't remember writing it, not word for word, but the ink was hers, the yearning too familiar to deny. It read, "Some people enter your life so quietly, you don't notice the hole they leave when they go." It wasn't addressed. It wasn't signed. But it didn't have to be. Around midday, Mira, her part-time assistant, barely 23 and full of sharp instincts, was organizing the back room when she called out, "Eleanor, did you mean to keep this?" She held up a photograph, creased at the corners, time-stained and faded. It was a snapshot Eleanor had completely forgotten. A poetry. Reading downtown, maybe 12 years ago. There she was, blurry in the background, mid-laugh. And there, standing a few feet away, not looking at the camera, was Jonas. They weren't standing together. but they were in the same frame. And now, looking at the space between them, Eleanor realized something her memory had hidden until now. He had been there. All this time. In the periphery. That evening, after Mira left, Eleanor dug through an old box in the attic. It smelled of cedar and old hope. Inside, beneath holiday cards and yellowed receipts, she found it. A journal she had started the year after her divorce. She had written only 7 entries. One of them, on a snowy December night, said, "He came in again today. Said he liked how the shop smelled. I told him it was cinnamon. He said he'd come back just to smell it again." I laughed, but I didn't look up. I think it's safer when he doesn't see my eyes. She stared at the page, fingers trembling. She had written about Jonas years before she allowed herself to admit he mattered. That night, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed while Greg read the news aloud from his tablet. Something about snowfall delays and a local bakery reopening. She nodded at the right moments, even managed a soft smile when he mentioned pumpkin, scones, but her mind was elsewhere, lingering somewhere between a dusty photo and the way Jonas once looked at her and said nothing, yet somehow still said everything. She excused herself early, claiming a headache. In truth, her heart felt swollen, like it was trying to remember something her brain had buried for protection. She lit a candle in her study, opened her old journal again, and reread every line about him, every unfinished sentence, every metaphor, that tried too hard to stay ambiguous. It was clear now. She hadn't just loved him in silence, she had loved him in denial. And then, one small thing she had missed. Tucked between the journal pages was a receipt from a bookstore in Portland, dated 2 years ago. On the back, written in the same handwriting she barely recognized as her own, was a note. "I saw him today. He was buying poetry again. I pretended not to notice. He pretended not to see me. But I think we both knew." Eleanor exhaled shakily. That wasn't about Jonas visiting her. That was about her seeing him, somewhere unexpected, in a different city. On a day she wasn't supposed to feel anything, which meant she hadn't just been a passive receiver of this affection. She had gone looking, even if it was unspoken, even if it was never acted on. There had been a choice. A moment when her eyes found him in a crowd, and stayed. The memory came back suddenly. A rainy afternoon, 2 years ago. She was visiting her daughter in Portland, wandering through old bookstores while Emma was at work, and there he was, across the street, carrying a paper bag of books, looking older, looking the same. She hadn't crossed the road. She had just watched, and that's when she whispered the words she had never said aloud, not even to herself until now. "I looked at him, but I was thinking of you." The days after Jonas's visit began to blur, not in forgetfulness, but in a kind of suspended awareness, like everything in Eleanor's life had been lit by a softer light. She moved through her routines with precision, unlocking the shop each morning, arranging the front display, preparing a pot of tea no one asked for. But her mind drifted. She caught herself looking toward the door more often, listening for the sound of the bell that marked a new arrival. Sometimes she imagined it, heard the chime in her mind, only to find the room empty. On Monday afternoon, she spent nearly 30 minutes reorganizing the poetry section, pretending it was for the holiday display, but secretly drawn back to the same authors Jonas had once searched for. She picked up the Neruda book he favored, running her fingers down the spine, stopping at page 27 where she had once underlined, "I want to do with you what spring does with the cherry trees." She closed the book gently, as though the sentence might escape if she let it breathe too long. At home, Greg was as kind as ever, offering her the larger blanket on the couch, letting her choose the movie, reheating leftovers without complaint. But his kindness felt distant now, more like good manners than intimacy. He had not noticed the envelope on her desk, the one addressed to no one, resting next to the flickering candle she lit every evening. Or maybe he had, and had chosen silence over confrontation. That, too, was part of their love. Deliberate. Avoidance packaged as peace. One evening, Eleanor stayed late at the bookstore under the excuse of doing inventory. She turned off the lights and sat in the dark, the faint glow from the streetlight illuminating the outlines of the shelves, the plants, the door. She thought about that night 2 years ago in Portland, about how she had spotted Jonas across the street. How her first instinct was to call his name, but instead she ducked into a shop and watched him from behind a row of used records. He never saw her, but she remembered how he walked, how he carried his books against his chest like they were something fragile and worth protecting. It had felt too much like a metaphor. Now, sitting in that same bookstore he used to visit, Eleanor whispered into the quiet, "What would I have said if I had crossed the street?" The silence didn't answer, but her chest ached in reply. 2. Days later, Mira found a shoebox behind the poetry section, tucked in the back where no customer ever wandered. "This yours?" she asked, dusting it off and bringing it to the counter. Eleanor blinked. She hadn't seen that box in over a decade. Inside were pieces of a forgotten self, photographs from early author events, a few yellowing bookmarks with literary quotes, and an old receipt from a printer repair shop. Nothing remarkable. But at the very bottom was a folded paper, carefully pressed between 2 postcards. It was a flyer for a poetry reading, dated 12 years ago, and on the corner, Jonas's name was scrawled in pencil. She remembered that night. It had been raining, and the power flickered during the second reading. He had sat 2 rows behind her. She hadn't noticed him until the applause, when their eyes met for only a second too long. Afterward, he disappeared before she could find words to say hello. Now, in the quiet of the shop, she stared at the pencil-marked name and realized something that made her stomach twist. She hadn't forgotten him. She had been collecting him. That evening, she walked home slowly, taking the long way through the square. The bakery's windows glowed amber, casting golden light onto the snow-covered sidewalk. She paused in front of the florist's, where dried eucalyptus and thistle hung from string, their scent earthy and comforting. Everything in town looked the same, but she felt altered, like a new layer of skin had begun to form, thinner but more honest. At home, Greg was preparing dinner. He looked up and smiled, setting down the ladle. "You're quiet lately," he said gently. She nodded, and for a moment she thought of telling him. Not about Jonas, not really, but about the ache, about the feeling of being half awake in her own life. But instead, she replied, "I'm just tired." He accepted that. He always did. That was his mercy, and perhaps his mistake. Later that night, Eleanor reread the poems she once gave to Jonas, tucked between books when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Small gestures, silent declarations. Back then, she thought that loving quietly was safer, purer. Now she wondered if it was just unfinished. She closed the book and whispered, "Is it still love, if it never had a voice?" The room didn't answer, but her silence did. On Friday, the snow began to fall thick and slow, blanketing Bridgeley in the kind of hush that made even footsteps feel like a secret. Eleanor arrived at the shop earlier than usual, craving the solitude before customers filtered in. She set a kettle to boil and lit the small candle behind the register. A ritual now, like a silent signal to the version of herself that only lived here, between pages and memory. Around noon, the postman delivered a small envelope addressed to the shop. No return address, no handwriting she recognized. Inside was a thin ivory note card. On it, a single sentence. "There are still poems I haven't read." Below, a signature. Jonas. She stared at the card for a long time. The words weren't romantic. They weren't even overtly personal. but they landed in her chest like a soft blow, stirring something buried beneath years of folded laundry and polite conversations. That evening, she didn't go home immediately. Instead, she took the long way again, turning left where she usually turned right, ending up near the old train station that now functioned more as scenery than service. There, beneath the flickering yellow light, stood the wooden bench where she once saw him reading. She sat down, pulled out her notebook, and began to write. Not poetry, not a letter, but questions. Why did I never say your name out loud? Why? Did I only love you in December? Why does a quiet heart hurt the loudest? She didn't cry. The air was too still for tears. But something shifted. Something old and brittle broke quietly inside her, like the snap of a twig beneath snow. That night, Greg found her standing in the kitchen, her coat still on, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't filled. He looked at her with concern, stepping closer. Are you okay? She opened her mouth, and for the first time in years considered saying, No. I think I'm in love with someone I was never allowed to name, but instead, she said, Yes. Just tired. Again. Always tired. Greg nodded. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, and she felt it like a question she couldn't answer. After he went to bed, she opened the ivory card again and read the sentence, aloud, just once. Then she placed it between the pages of letters to a young poet, right where she had underlined, Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart. The following Monday, Eleanor walked into the bookstore with a folded paper tucked inside her coat pocket. She had rewritten the letter 3 times the night before, and in the end decided not to bring the version with polished phrases and carefully edited regret. She brought the first draft, the one with crossed out lines, ink smudges, and a visible tremble in the curves of her handwriting. It was the most honest one. And that had to count for something. She didn't know if she would give it to him. Jonas hadn't returned since the note. But knowing he was near, that he was still reading, still leaving pieces of himself between sentences, made her feel less alone in the quiet ache. Midday passed slowly. Mira played soft music and rearranged displays for the winter reading challenge. Snow tapped lightly against the windows. No one spoke of him. But Eleanor felt his presence, as though he was somewhere in the room just out of sight. Around 3:15, the bell above the door rang. And there he was. Jonas entered without ceremony. No coat, just a heavy sweater and that same quiet smile that always looked a little sad. He greeted Mira politely, then drifted toward the nonfiction aisle. Eleanor didn't move, didn't call out. She watched as he picked up a book about winter birds, flipped through the pages like someone searching for a lost memory. Then, he turned. Their eyes met. He walked toward her, not urgently, not cautiously, but with the ease of someone who had waited a long time to take this exact step. When he reached the counter, he didn't speak right away. He placed the bird book down and said softly, "You still sell the best kind of silence." She laughed. It surprised her. "I wrote you something," she said. "Did you?" he asked, voice low. She handed him the envelope, not sealed, not folded. His fingers brushed hers when he took it. "I might not be ready to read it," he admitted. "That's all right," she replied. "I wasn't ready when I wrote it." He didn't open it, just slipped it into his coat pocket and nodded. "I'll walk around a bit." She nodded back, her heart both breaking and mending in the same beat, and as he wandered toward the poetry shelf, the snow outside began to fall again, soft, uncertain, quiet, just like them. 3 days passed. Jonas didn't return. The envelope remained unopened, she assumed, and Eleanor told herself she hadn't expected anything else. But expectation is a stubborn thing, rarely obeying what we say we want. On the fourth evening, she found herself standing at the train station again. It wasn't planned. She had simply walked until her feet brought her there. The wooden bench still creaked, the light still flickered, and the wind still whispered things she didn't want to hear. She sat and pulled her scarf tighter. In her coat pocket, she carried a small folded letter, not the one she had given Jonas, but another one, an older one. Never sent. Dated 7 winters ago. I think if I say it out loud, it becomes betrayal. But it's already betrayal, isn't it? To love someone with this much quiet? I don't want to ruin anything, but I'm tired of pretending silence is virtue. She had written it after a conversation with Greg. He had been planning their summer trip, talking about rental cabins, about Emma maybe visiting, about new beginnings, and she had smiled and nodded, all the while hearing a different voice in her head, Jonas's, from months earlier, asking if she believed that poetry could heal what time could not. She didn't. Not then. But she had wanted to. Back at the shop, the next day, Eleanor found something unexpected in the mail, a brown envelope with no stamp, no address, just her name in pencil. Inside was her letter, the one she had given to Jonas, unfolded, annotated. In the margins were his notes, not paragraphs, just small reactions, initials, dates, memories. At the bottom, in handwriting she didn't recognize immediately, but felt in her chest he had written, I did love you. Quietly, completely, for a long time. But I thought I was the only one. Eleanor sat down slowly, the letter trembling in her hands. Her world did not collapse. It did not explode. It simply shifted. Like a door opening onto a room she had been too afraid to enter. And suddenly, every silence made sense. Every moment they hadn't touched. Every look they had exchanged without knowing where it might lead. She wasn't alone in the ache. He had been there too, all along. That night, Eleanor didn't light her usual candle. She sat instead in the dark, the annotated letter in her lap, eyes closed as if the absence of light might somehow make space for understanding. The house was quiet. Greg was at a late dinner with colleagues, and the silence felt less like peace and more like permission. She reread the final line over and over. I thought I was the only one. How many years had they both waited for the other to speak first? How many glances, near confessions, accidental touches had carried the weight of what could never be said? She remembered once, years ago during a heavy storm, Jonas had offered to drive her home after a poetry reading. She had declined, not because of propriety, but because she was afraid that in the silence of that car ride, something would slip out. A look, a word, a truth that would unravel everything. Eleanor had always believed herself to be the responsible one, the loyal one. But now, reading his words, she saw the cost of that responsibility. A love unlived, a lifetime of emotional fidelity to someone who never fully asked for her heart in the first place. The next morning, she told Greg she needed a day. No reason given. He nodded, distracted by a spreadsheet and the smell of burning toast. She left the house before he noticed the letter missing from her desk. She walked to the edge of town, past the bakery, the post office, the ice cream parlor shuttered for winter. She walked to the lake, the one they used to visit in spring, when Emma was still small and giggled at dragonflies. There, she sat on the frozen bench overlooking the water and read the letter again. The cold stung her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. Her tears froze at the edges of her eyes, tiny crystals catching the morning sun. She whispered, not to the air, not even to Jonas, but to herself. We could have had something. And the wind, cruel and honest, did not deny it. She stayed there for an hour, maybe longer, until the ache settled into something quieter, not quite peace, not quite surrender, just the steady heartbeat of someone finally willing to admit she had loved and been loved. Even if it was all in silence. When she returned to the shop that afternoon, the light had shifted, the golden hue of late day casting long shadows across the floorboards. The store was empty. Mira had left a note. Closed early. Snow's coming. Eleanor stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the wood worn smooth by years of shared small talk, returned books, and silent longings. She opened the register not for money, but for a drawer beneath it, the one where she kept things she never dared part with. There, beside an old Polaroid and a faded theater stub, lay a bookmark Jonas had once forgotten between the pages of the bell jar. She had meant to return it, but it stayed, like a small truth she wasn't ready to give back. She took it out now, held it beside the letter, and allowed herself to feel it all. Not the fantasy of what could have been, but the reality of what truly was. A love that existed. In glances, in margin notes, in shared books and missed chances. A love that had no name, but never needed one to leave a mark. Greg arrived just before closing, brushing snow from his coat and asking if she wanted Thai or Italian. She stared at him for a long moment, at the man who had stood beside her, kindly, quietly, but never completely. "Greg," she said gently, and something in her tone made him pause. "I loved someone else," she whispered, eyes not accusing, not apologizing. "A long time ago. I never acted on it, but I never stopped feeling it." He didn't speak for a moment. Then, with more grace than she had expected, he asked, "Do you still love him?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes." Greg exhaled, looked away, then nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me now, even if it's late." And just like that, the room didn't collapse. The silence didn't shatter. It softened. That night, Eleanor stood in front of the shop, watching snow collect on the street lamp. She held the annotated letter in her hands and smiled, not because it was painless, but because it was finally real. She had been loved. She had loved back. And now, finally, she could breathe inside that truth. The house felt different with Greg gone. He had left that morning. 2 packed bags, a soft goodbye, no confrontation, no questions, just a long look at her from the doorway, like he was memorizing her. She didn't cry. She had already done the crying inside, over months, maybe years. But as soon as the door closed and his car pulled away, something inside her shifted. A subtle collapse, like the sigh of old wood in winter. She stood in the hallway, still wearing the sweater he had folded and placed neatly on the bed. The mea. Silence pressed in around her, dense and complete, the kind of quiet that comes not from peace, but from absence. The clock ticked on the wall behind her, louder now than she remembered. The sound wasn't rhythmic, it was accusatory. Time had passed. Too much of it, and she had spent it balancing between what was safe and what was true. Eleanor walked slowly to the kitchen, her bare feet cold against the tiled floor. The tea Greg had brewed earlier sat untouched on the counter, lukewarm and pointless. She poured it down the drain without tasting it. She wandered through the house like someone walking through a dream, or worse, a memory. Each object seemed to hum, with echoes. The framed photo of them in Italy, the indentation on the sofa where he always sat, the book he never finished. Nothing was broken. That made it worse. In her study, the window was cracked open. A draft moved through the room like a whisper. She didn't close it. She sat instead in the armchair by the desk and pulled the letter from Jonas out of the drawer, not the annotated one, but the first. Her own words, written tremblingly, before any answers. "I loved you in the quiet spaces of my life, the spaces between choosing what was right and what I truly wanted. She rested her head against the back of the chair. She didn't need to read the rest. She knew it by heart now. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing snowflakes against the glass like fingers. She remembered a winter 10 years ago, when Jonas had laughed at something she said. A real laugh, caught off guard, like a chord struck without warning. She hadn't told him then that the sound stayed with her for days. She had never told him most things, and now she couldn't tell him anything at all. By early evening, the sky turned the color of pewter. Eleanor didn't bother turning on the lights. She moved through shadows as if she belonged to them, her silhouette reflected faintly on the glass of the patio door. The snow outside had begun to fall in earnest, covering everything with an illusion of purity she didn't believe in. She sat on the edge of the bed, hers now, entirely hers, and stared at the indented half of the mattress where Greg had slept. For years, that space seemed to echo more than the rest of the room. Not because he was gone, but because she had never fully met him there. Her body had lain beside his, but her mind had always drifted somewhere else, to someone else, even in silence. She reached for the record player on the nightstand and placed an old vinyl gently onto the turntable. The opening notes of a Bach partita filled the room, hesitant and searching. It was a piece Jonas once mentioned in passing, calling it music that aches. As the melody unfolded, she walked to the window, her fingers resting lightly on the E. Curtain. The town below looked quiet, serene. A couple walked arm in arm beneath a street lamp, their laughter muffled by the snow. It struck her how easy it was for some people to belong to each other without question. She had never allowed that. Not with Greg, not with Jonas, not even with herself. Her entire life, she had held back, out of propriety, caution, and the persistent belief that waiting made love deeper. But now, as the music slowed and the room dimmed, she understood the real cost of restraint. It was not dignity she had clung to. It was fear. And that fear had taken everything. Not in one cruel sweep, but in quiet inches, until there was nothing left to lose but memory. The song ended. She didn't flip the record. She sat in stillness, heart beating softly in her throat, a breath caught between regret and release. And then she whispered, almost inaudibly, "I waited too long." Not as a confession, not as an apology, just as fact. Somewhere inside her, the version of Eleanor who once believed in wild, reckless love faded gently into the dark. What remained was a woman who had loved deeply, quietly, and far too late, and no one could hear her now but the silence itself. She stood up, finally, legs stiff from stillness, and made her way back to the study. On the edge of the desk sat a candle she hadn't lit in days, and beside it the notebook where she used to write morning thoughts, a habit that faded when she stopped believing her days held anything new. But tonight, she opened it. Not to write a poem or a letter, just a line, a truth. I missed my chance, not because it didn't exist, but because I waited for it to knock louder. She put the pen down gently, like placing a flower on a grave, and closed the book. Outside, the snow kept falling, and for the first time in years, she did not look out the window. She simply let the night hold her, and in that quiet, she did not feel healed, only honest, and maybe that was enough. 3 days after Greg left, and 2 since Jonas's letter had returned her own words to her, Eleanor found herself awake long before sunrise. The town outside still slept beneath a sky, smudged with ash gray, and the snow on her windowsill hadn't melted overnight. Everything was hushed and unmoving, except for her thoughts. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands cupped around a mug of lukewarm tea, watching the steam rise slowly, then disappear, like everything she had once hoped for. The letter still lay on the table, opened and folded over at the edges, like it had been read too many times for its own good. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. The words had carved themselves somewhere quieter, somewhere permanent. She rose when the clock struck 6, out of habit more than purpose. At the shop, the key turned stiffly in the lock, and the bell overhead greeted her like a friend who knew not to ask questions. She didn't turn on the lights right away. Let the morning seep in gently. Then she saw it. A book. The essential Rilke, placed neatly on the counter, a soft cream envelope tucked inside its cover. Her breath caught. It wasn't from her inventory. It was a copy Jonas had once picked up from the poetry shelf years ago, during his second winter in Bridgeley. She remembered the moment clearly, the smell of cinnamon, his coat still damp from snow, and the way his fingers lingered on the cover like he was asking permission to feel something deeper. With careful hands, she pulled out the envelope. Inside, a single card. No name, no salutation. I came back once before the letter. You weren't there. I left this, thinking maybe you'd find it when you needed to. I don't know if that's now, or if it ever will be. But I wanted you to know. I knew. I always knew. She read it again. And again. Then she smiled. Not a joyful smile, but a knowing one. Like someone finding a missing puzzle piece not to complete the picture, but simply to prove they hadn't imagined its shape. Later that afternoon, with the letter safely tucked into the drawer beneath the register, Eleanor stepped into the back room to retrieve a shipment she had forgotten to open. Mira was off that day, and the quietness of the store felt softer somehow. Less lonely, more like a blanket than a weight. As she pulled open the last box, a slip of paper floated out, landing at her feet. It wasn't from the publisher. It was handwritten, folded once, slightly yellowed. Her name was on the outside in pencil. The writing was unmistakably Jonas's. She opened it with a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That night in Portland, I saw you. You were across the street. I watched you watch me, and I waited. Just long enough. Long enough to believe that if you crossed, I'd take your hand and never let go. But you didn't. And I told myself that meant you were happy. But now I think maybe we were both just scared. Eleanor sat down slowly on the unpacked box, the paper still trembling in her hand. The memory hit her in pieces. The bookstore, the glass window, his familiar silhouette with the paper bag of books, her feet rooted to the sidewalk. She had thought he hadn't seen her. She had convinced herself it had been her secret, but it hadn't. He had known. He had waited. He had hoped. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't the only one who had carried the silence. She wasn't the only one who had mistaken stillness for strength, hesitation for protection. They had both been waiting, and both had walked away too gently. She stood up, letter still open, and walked to the front of the shop. Outside, dusk was settling, tinting the snow in muted lavender. She opened the door, let the cold air kiss her face, and exhaled the kind of breath that only comes after years of holding too much. She didn't cry, but something in her released. She stepped outside, crossed the street. Not toward anyone, just to feel what it meant to move, to choose, even when no one was waiting. She looked back at the shop, the windows glowing amber behind her. Then she whispered, to the snow, to herself, to the years lost in waiting. We were both there. We just didn't speak. And this time, that truth felt enough. If this story found something quiet inside you, something you haven't touched in a while, maybe let it stay a little longer. And if you've ever loved in silence, waited too long, or whispered someone's name into the dark, you're not alone. We'd love to hear your story too, if you feel like sharing. Leave a comment. Or not. Just know, we're here, listening, And if this felt like coming home, you might want to stay for the next letter too. Subscribe, gently.